Over the summer, we saw protests across the country fighting for racial justice. We'll examine how we can improve race relations here in Nevada. That's this week on Nevada Week.
Support for Nevada Week is provided by Senator William H. Hernstadt and additional supporting sponsors.
This summer, thousands took to the streets across the nation protesting police brutality and systemic racism. The scene in Las Vegas was no different. After the crowds dispersed, we sat down with cultural leaders, educators, activists, and academics to discuss what needs to change. Across the board, we heard time and time again that Southern Nevada needs to address the school-to-prison pipeline. In this two-part conversation, we'll begin this week by breaking down the history and root causes of school-to-prison pipelines. Then, next week, we'll look ahead to potential solutions. So Tyler, we're going to be talking a lot about local history, national history here. This is a big topic right now. Systemic racism, a lot of people are talking about it. Racism taught in schools. Is this being taught in school right now?
Students do not come out with a deep enough understanding of how slavery impacted not just the period up to 1865, but how the legacy of slavery followed and permeated all the way up to the 21st century. And essentially, there is attached to that a lack of focus upon African American history. Most students still emerge from most public schooling systems only knowing a few select names, maybe Harriet Tubman, maybe Martin Luther King Jr., maybe Rosa Parks. But outside of that, the narrative is that those are the only three that matter within the grand scale. And then there's also a misinterpretation and a misuse of all of these figures as well. So I certainly think it's being taught, but not in a way that's sufficient to understand its broader impact. That just because the Emancipation Proclamation was released in 1863 and then the Civil War ended in 1865, and then June 19th being the last announcement that slavery had been abolished in the United States, students don't fully appreciate or understand what happened after that particular moment and how the legacies of slavery followed Black people into what we know as the Jim Crow period, and then all the way up into the mass incarceration regime that we are currently discussing today.
And let's talk, of course, part of that history is our local history here, and we have our own storied history, and we're talking about both explicit and implicit racism, and we're going to talk more about that. But first off, is that being taught in schools?
My understanding with discussions with CCSD teachers that it's not being taught in schools, and there's a variety of factors to account for that. On the one hand, CCSD does have a problem with representation of school teachers, particularly the demographics of school teachers matching the population within the CCSD school district. Remains overwhelmingly white, remains overwhelmingly women. And it's not that white teachers can't reach students of color, but studies have consistently shown that having the presence of a teacher who identifies the same way that a student does increases their chances for performance and success greatly, both during their education and after. And so there is a dearth, particularly of Black male teachers within the Clark County School District, and that is very much attached to this nationwide problem that we're currently facing.
I've been teaching for some years now. There's semesters I have 100, 125 students, maybe 1% Black. I don't even see Black students. I'm not saying they're not there. I don't encounter them. I'm looking for them. You know, I want young Black males and females to see me. Even for me, when I saw my first Black professor, I said, this is different.
When you're looking at the system, and because you're working in community colleges, let's talk about that. What changes do you think we need? You've already mentioned one of them, just having persons of color that are in positions that are teaching a lot of these courses. What else?
When I was going through my English department, I was in English. I think I was the only Black in the department. Maybe 1% faculty was Black. So no doubt we have to have more people of color in front of the class. Now, those people of color have to be conscious as well, because I know if you go through school not with a knowledge of self, then you're really going to come out with a Eurocentric mentality. I think the research is starting to say now that the majority of teachers, especially maybe K through 12, are young white women. And they're saying now, when they say, I want to help you, Kip, to be better, I want to help you, they're really saying, I want to help you to be white. You know, not really navigate this thing to who you are. And this is what the research is saying. That's just not my opinion.
I would be willing to place a bet that most students coming through the Clark County School District probably could not identify a man named John Howell, despite the fact that he is the earliest known African American to settle what we now call Southern Nevada in the late 19th century. And so if students aren't getting the national narrative of African American history within this school district, they're certainly not getting the local narrative. I went through the school district here throughout the 90s and the early 2000s. I emerged with very little knowledge of anything having to do with African Americans within the city of Las Vegas. Everything I learned came from conversations that I had with people.
Why is that so important? Of course, we're talking about school-to-prison pipeline, so we're talking a lot about the criminal justice side of this and policing and some other policy issues there. But we also are talking about education attainment. We've seen huge disproportionality there. Learning about this history, both local and the national combined, why is it so important to this conversation?
Well, because the history of African Americans is one of a people oppressed, but a people who also resist the system, and oftentimes, at least from a legislative perspective, emerge victorious. So if you're leaving out the narratives of African Americans under the assumption that they're simply a minority population, you are eliminating the possibility that students, particularly students of color from underrepresented backgrounds, you're withholding a narrative of excellence from them. They are not getting the full depth and breadth of what people had to go through, not just on a national level, but on a local level as well. And if we are not promoting those local histories as attached to the national narrative, we can continue along this trajectory that somehow Las Vegas is special because it's a diverse place to live. But diversity means nothing unless inclusion's attached to it as well.
If we go back to the 70s and 80s, we didn't have student resource officers or police on campuses, but that dramatically changed at some point where we are now. You give us a little context to that history. What actually changed? Why did we go to almost of a policing of schools the way that we have now?
African Americans in the 1960s, according to police reports, had been leveling complaints against police departments that there was an overrepresentation of police presence within their neighborhoods, and it was not warranted that they were there. The police would always brush this off and just claim this was due to high crime rates or statistical anomalies in these areas. But the overwhelming majority of African Americans in these areas were peaceful, law-abiding citizens. But the police departments didn't care about that. The perception was a person of African descent was considered inherently dangerous, particularly black men. And so going into the 1980s, the West Side is starting to decay as money is leaving these areas, and then drugs start to come into some of these areas. But the conception here among some social scientists is that there is a deliberate increase of a police presence that would start to feed into the problems and lead to the distrust of local officers. That formation of a police culture will migrate into schools to where uniformed officers are brought into schools under the assumption that they are there to serve and protect the population. But one thing we find both locally and nationally is that the way officers handle students of African descent is different than the way they handle white students. And this has been studied and proven by a number of people who have looked into the data here, in that young black men are perceived as more of a threat than young white men. And this history goes back all the way to slavery, but is encapsulated by the case of Emmett Till. In that, if you look at the coroner's report of the FBI, he was called a child who was big for his age. And you see this as a persistent case every time a black child is killed at the hands of the police department or by the hands of vigilantes. So you have uniformed officers coming from a culture of policing in which they are perceiving black males as an immediate threat going into schools that might be occupied by a larger percentage of African Americans. They're called in to handle a student who is perceived to be acting out. And the assumption among many is that officers are going into these classrooms prepared to use physical force against a child. So the people who criticize the school-to-prison pipeline is that there is a perception that there's a certain inequity operating here, in that uniformed officers who are entering schools that are largely marginalized economically, they are divested from within the district or within the city. The perception among many students, young people within these schools, is that this is like a prison.
Right now, when we're looking at youth incarceration and we're looking at the way that law enforcement plays out in schools, when we have school resource officers who have been brought into a school in order to enforce discipline that really should be enforced at the school level, that causes a great deal of frustration in pushing kids into what's called the school to prison pipeline. A lot of the background on that, right, is it's the broken windows theory, and what that theory says is that, cracking down on very small offenses in order to make people feel safer discourages more serious crimes. That has been unequivocally debunked in the way that this has played out. All it does is lead to more interaction with the criminal justice system, which necessarily predicts a child's future involvement with the criminal justice system. The earlier a child has that interaction, the more likely they are to reoffend, and that's proven over and over again in all the studies when we're looking at the rate of recidivism among young people.
One of the things, I don't know if you know the statistics, we were surprised to find out that 13% of the entire student body population at the Clark County School District are black students. Over 50% of the disciplinary referrals are black students. So way more black students are being disciplined than any other race or ethnicity at the school district. That's a big concern. Essentially what that's telling us is that more black students are being targeted for discipline, potentially. When you were in school, did you see that? Was that kind of a known thing?
Yeah, and what I think caused it was that disengagement between like the upbringing of the teacher, which was normally predominantly white, and then the upbringing of the student, which probably grew up in an urban neighborhood. So the body language probably came off as disrespect to the teacher, but it was just normal for the kid. So being in the Clark County School District, which was kind of adopting a no discipline policy, like a zero tolerance policy.
Yeah.
You can get in trouble for pretty much anything the teacher deemed was disrespectful, which could be anything.
When we talk about access and opportunity in general, we look at how students of color and or marginalized students don't show up in the curriculum, right? They don't see themselves mirrored in schools. We look at who they have as role models in terms of teaching teachers. We know that there's a racial and cultural diversity gap around who teaches in public education. Our teaching population is 80% white, monocultural female. However, schools for the first time in our country are majority minoritized and marginalized communities. And so with that culture gap comes disparities in how folks read culture in students.
Sometimes I feel like people think I come across as more aggressive than I tend to be. I like to use my hands when I talk. Sometimes my voice isn't as quieter as some of the other students. So some people tend to think I'm being aggressive or loud, which makes me feel like I don't even want to talk in class. Especially in my AP and honors classes, where there tends to be less Black people than the classes, and there tends to be less Black teachers than the regular classes. I feel like I'm kind of like tiptoeing around what I really want to say for to not try to look the angry black woman.
I think it's a lot of the issue is probably like the school resource officers, right? So now you have these polices on campuses, and when the teacher feels the need, she can just go get the police, right? So even if it's for like a small disciplinary action, such as, okay, he talked back to me disrespectful, instead of going out in the hallway and having a conversation with him now, I'm going to get the school resource officer, which is probably going to blow it all out of proportion. It's probably just going to lead like to juvenile court or something like that.
We hear a lot about implicit bias. That's a new term, not a new term, but it's a term that is being shared a lot more in kind of where we are with the current root cause explorations because of some of the racial unrest and the protests that we've had. When you look at our district, I mean, can you identify some areas where there are clear implicit bias that are really changing how students get into the criminal justice system?
Oh, suspensions and expulsions, 100%. You know, kids, African American and Hispanic youth are kicked out and suspended, expelled, marginalized on a daily level. You know, here in our school, and this is not a Clark County issue. This is a national issue. This is not something that's just a Las Vegas problem. This is a national problem.
What biases do you think exist out there? I mean, is it can you give us some context on?
When you give, well, I would tell you, first and foremost, I mean, there's lots of research around an African American child and what our perceptions as Caucasian Americans looking at an African American child, right? Oftentimes the biases are that we believe those children are older. We believe a possibly an 8-year-old African American child is 11. So we expect 11-year-old behaviors from an 8-year-old, not really understanding that they're still 8. I mean, I think there's also some embedded racism. Let's not try to dance around that issue, right? There's also cultural differences and cultural norms that are different.
How about gender specificity? Do we have a lot of girls that are coming and accessing Harbor's resources?
About 24% of our population that comes and touches is our girls too, and that lines up pretty in lockstep with our juvenile justice numbers too.
Are there any specific needs or specific challenges that girls are having? And again, let's talk about the disproportionality here. I mean, are African American girls, are referrals higher than other races?
I would assume yes, because in the juvenile justice system, they are definitely higher. And oftentimes with girls, we just have some cultural issues with girls. Girls are far more verbal than boys are, especially for teenage issues, right? So we have a lot more girls that are detained for crimes that a boy would not be detained for. And a lot of that has to do with the inability to find meaningful resources for girls here within the Valley. This is a national issue also. It's hard to get programs for girls because a lot of times we're not talking about programs for the level of criminality. Oftentimes we're talking about massive amounts of trauma on girls that we're trying to find programming for. And it's very ugly, it's very messy work dealing with a young person that's dealt with trauma and trying to work through them out of that. It can be angry, aggressive work, very verbal work, definitely.
Let's talk more specifically about some of the disproportionality we have in some of the disciplinary actions of the district. These might be things that on the outside somebody might say, if you've got a disproportionate number of African American students that are getting referrals for behavior expulsions or suspensions, that seems like it should be an overnight shift because you just make some policy changes there. First off, I just want to give a couple statistics. Applaud the district, first off, for the data that they're providing now. This is a report that I think they just issued. But it shows in 2017, 2018, 41% of expulsions were African Americans, 13% of the student body is African American. And then the numbers go up. Behavioral referrals, 50% of behavioral referrals are African American. Again, 13% is enrollment. First off, why are we seeing such disproportion of African Americans that are getting these referrals?
So first of all, for years, the district did not share data. We kept the data very guarded. And I think probably with the best intentions. The thinking was, this is student data. It's very sensitive data. We want to protect. The problem is, if you don't have a conversation about the data and you don't review the data, then the data is not going to change.
I mean, I think it's quite clear. I think one element that's missing is really understanding where these disparities are. And my conclusion, is that we're over policing schools that are primarily Black and Latino. So what that data revealed is that Black students account for 43% of police referrals, while only representing 14% of the entire student body. They also represent 40% of written warnings issued by the Clark County School District. And those warnings, that's where these issues really start. You have that warning, you start creating that record, when really it isn't necessary. There's other measures that a school can take in order to intervene and discipline a student and get them on a corrective path. We compare that to white students who account for about 25% of the student body. They only had a 14% referral rate from police into the juvenile justice system. So I think the data is quite clear that no matter how you look at it, there's a major racial disparity that needs to be addressed.
I think it's easy for people, especially people of privilege, to argue, well, those must be the kids that are committing the acts and getting in trouble. Even though statistically, it doesn't make sense. If 13% of your population is represented by any particular subgroup or student group, it can't be that 50% of that same population are the only ones committing acts that are worthy of removal. The other staggering thing with the data you just read, behavior referrals are 100% discretionary. Principals have choice. Expulsion, they're statutory driven. So that one's a little bit more of a challenge. I think it's easy for educators and principals to argue, I have to keep my building safe. And this is the way historically we have justified keeping buildings safe, putting out kids that commit acts that we catch them doing. And I think that principals argued, well, I'm keeping my building safe. I have to do what I have to do.
I guess the level of severity then of some of this disciplinary action, some of the categories, truancy, marijuana possession, it looks like a lot of fighting's violent, but
Sure.
Fights on school. And then there's this other category that is the biggest, it's actually in the data that was just reported on, it is the biggest category, other. You can throw anything in there. And if we're talking about discretionary, that could potentially be a behavioral issue or something like that.
Absolutely. And that's why organizations like the ACLU, like other advocacy groups, the Office for Civil Rights, that is one of their biggest concerns is if we're calling out behavior, then let's call it out for what it is, not for what it might be. And we tend to lump every other thing into this other category or insubordination. And when we use those kinds of categories, that hides data. And so I think the more we can define the data and call the data out for what it is, the more accurate the data is. When we start seeing disproportionate numbers, especially in data fields like you just brought up, some of those categories, it does lend itself to people, adults who get aggravated with kids, making decisions, not even knowing the full story sometimes.
There's disproportionality all throughout all of our negative systems. How do we rectify that? We start to understand where the problem starts earliest. And now that Dr. Jar has been sharing data with us, we can really identify where these issues are, and we can start identifying real strategies to address these issues. In the past, we all spoke anecdotally about these issues, and we guessed, and we ran about, and we pointed fingers at each other, and it was really a great, robust but inaccurate conversation. Now we have the ability to really nail down where those resources could be best expended, and to really save children.
If a student of color talks loud, that's usually comes off as disrespect, but it's not usually disrespect, it's just trying to get a point across, like trying to understand what's going on. Like, why am I getting in trouble? What did I do? I don't understand what I did wrong. But, usually teachers are authoritative figures, so they don't feel like they have to explain themselves to the students.
Yeah. What do you think's missing there? If you were to sit down with maybe some of your teachers that you saw that did this all the time, and you had an honest conversation with that teacher, and you could say, look, these are things I think you can do to maybe stop that behavior being the teacher's behavior, what would they be?
It'd probably just be like to have a conversation with the student. Like, I know it's hard to get the time to have a conversation with every student, but just seeing where a person came from, the background of a student, that can that can help with classroom engagement and help the teacher and the student actually, kind of bond together. That way they have more of a understanding of each other. See where the teacher is coming from and see where the student is coming from.
And the reality is that Black lives matter. And that doesn't say that to me that my life doesn't matter or a cop's life doesn't matter. It stands for we need to do better, and we need to do better now. And it needs to not be another discussion or another kick the can down the street. We need to do better now. There's Black kids in my system right now that have been marginalized their entire lives. We need to start having conversations about they matter today, right now. How do we make it better? And that starts with educational equity. That starts with access to services. That starts with, not arresting them for the same thing that I wouldn't get arrested for. That starts with how do we, do we put a kid on probation? Do we prosecute more? Do we arrest more? Do we detain more? At all of those different points in the juvenile justice system, there's disproportionality. So it's not just the cop on the street. This is an unfair system from the time that child was born until the time that child dies as a grown man. You know what I mean? So we need to be brave enough to have those conversations at all those different discussion points. Why the cops are the only ones taking the heat right now is beyond me. We all need to be taking the heat. And for all of us that aren't willing to stand up, we need to be taking the heat too.
If you would like any more information about any of the information that we discussed on this show, please visit our website at vegaspbs.org/Nevada-week. You can also always find us on social media at Nevada Week.